Imagine standing right where two massive rivers join, a place buzzing with nature, but also just soaked in history. We're talking about Fort Snelling State Park, right near the Minneapolis St. Paul airport. It's this incredible spot where so many stories come together.
That's a great way to put it. It's definitely more than just, a pretty park. The land itself feels layered with history. You can almost sense the echoes of the past there.
And that's exactly what we want to unpack today. We're doing a deep dive into Fort Snelling State Park, its history, the highlights, all the fascinating details that make it such a compelling place for anyone who loves to learn and explore.
Yeah, we'll touch on quite a bit. The geology, how glaciers shaped it, the geography that made it so important, the politics behind the treaties and the military base.
The culture, absolutely.
Hmm?
The Dakota heritage, the soldiers, the immigrants, and of course, what you can actually do there today.
Exactly. We want to give you a really rich picture, efficiently, but without, just throwing facts at you. Hopefully we'll have some of those aha moments as we connect the dots.
Okay, sounds great. So where do we start? The very beginning seems right, the land and the people who were there first.
Definitely. Long before any Europeans arrived, generations before, this spot where the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers meet was incredibly important to the Dakota Oyate, the Dakota Nation.
It had a special name, didn't it?
Yes, they call it Bidot, which means where the waters meet. And for them, it wasn't just geography, it was profoundly spiritual. The Amadeo Canton Dakota actually consider Bidot their place of origin, like the center of the earth.
Wow. The center of the earth. That's powerful. And this understanding goes way, way back.
Centuries, millennia even. Archaeological evidence suggests people first came to this area around 10,000 years ago, drawn by the rivers, the resources.
2,000 years. It's hard to even grasp that time scale. Okay, so let's jump forward quite a bit to the early 1800s. The United States is expanding, especially after the War of 1812. What brings them to this specific spot, to Bidot?
Well, strategy, mostly. The U.S. government saw controlling this confluence as key. It meant controlling exploration up the rivers, controlling the fur trade, which was huge then, and regulating American settlement pushing westward.
And keeping rivals out, I imagine.
Absolutely. Particularly keeping British influence out of the region. That was a major goal post-war of 1812.
So how did they secure the land for a fort?
It started back in 1805 with Zebulon Pike. He negotiated a treaty, Pike's Purchase, with some Dakota leaders. The idea was to get land, about 100,000 acres, specifically for a military post right there at the confluence.
But it wasn't straightforward, was it?
Not really. Pike's authority to make such a big deal was questionable at the time, and the U.S. Senate didn't even ratify it for a few years, so the legitimacy was a bit shaky from the start.
So the U.S. didn't immediately jump on building a fort.
No, it took the War of 1812 to really highlight the need.
Okay.
Then, in 1818, Major Stephen H. Long surveyed the area and really drove home its value. He noted its healthfulness, security, and a complete command of the river.
Okay, that phrase really sums up the military thinking. Health, security, command.
Exactly. So construction finally began in 1819. By 1820, this fort, initially called Fort St. Anthony, was the only U.S. military post in the entire Northwest. It basically became the launching point for American settlement in the region, the cradle of settlement, as it was called.
And his purpose wasn't just about territory.
No, it was also explicitly designed to enforce peace, as the government saw it, which mainly meant controlling the interactions and movements of the Ojibwe and the Dakota peoples.
And eventually, it got the name we know today.
Right. It was renamed Fort Snelling in honor of Colonel Josiah Snelling. He was the one who really oversaw the design and construction, its first commander. The whole thing was finished by 1825, a major statement of U.S. presence.
So for a while, it stood as this symbol of American power in the Northwest. But its history takes a really dark and tragic turn later on, doesn't it, with the US-Dakota War of 1862.
Yes, that war is an absolutely critical and incredibly painful part of Fort Snelling's story. It cast a very long shadow, leading to the largest mass execution in U.S. history.
What led up to such a devastating conflict?
It really goes back to treaties, specifically treaties in 1837 with the Ojibwe and Dakota, and then crucially the 1851 treaties of Traverse des Sioux and Mendota. Figures like Alexander Ramsey and Henry Sibley really pushed hard for those 1851 deals.
And these treaties involved land?
Vast amounts of land. The Dakotas were essentially forced to cede millions of acres of their ancestral homeland, and the terms, the payments, the promises, They were often unfair, misunderstood, or just plain broken by the U.S. government.
But broken promises, loss of land.
Loss of traditional ways of life, increasing pressure from settlers, delayed annuity payments leading to starvation. It created this incredibly desperate situation. Tensions just boiled over into open conflict in August 1862.
And the aftermath, particularly concerning the fort itself.
The aftermath was horrific. After the fighting stopped, hundreds of Dakota people, many of them women, children, elders, 9 combatants, were rounded up and forced into what can only be described as a concentration camp. Right there, on the river flats below Fort Snelling.
A concentration camp. At the fort.
Right below it. During the brutal winter of 1862 to 63, it wasn't, a formal military prison for combatants, but the conditions were deplorable. Hundreds died from exposure, from disease. There was a terrible measles epidemic. It's an incredibly traumatic memory associated with that site.
That's horrifying. And the consequences didn't end there.
No, far from it. In 1863, the Minnesota legislature actually voided all treaties with the Dakota. They passed a law essentially banning Dakota people from the state. It was an act of expulsion.
Unbelievable.
And then, adding further injustice, in November 1865, 2 Dakota leaders, Little Six and Medicine Bottle, who had fled to Canada, were kidnapped, brought back, and executed by hanging right outside the fort walls.
So for Dakota people today, how is this site viewed?
It's complex and deeply painful. It's sacred land, Bidut, their origin place. But it's also undeniably a site of genocide, a powerful symbol of settler colonialism and the immense suffering inflicted upon their ancestors. That history is still very raw and present.
It's vital that story is told and remembered. But the fort's military life continued after 1862, didn't it?
Oh, yes. It remained a significant military post for decades. During the later Plains Wars, for instance, it served as headquarters for some units of the famed Buffalo Soldiers, the African-American regiments.
Right, I've heard about that connection.
It was an active Army post right through until 1919. Then its role shifted a bit.
How so?
Well, between the World Wars, roughly 1920 to 1941, it got this nickname, the Country Club of the Army, which suggests maybe a slightly more relaxed pace, less of a frontier outpost feel. It was also used for officer training during World War I.
And then World War II brought another major role.
A very significant one. Starting in 1944, Fort Snelling became the home of the Military Intelligence Service Language School, the MISLS.
The language school, what was that about?
This was a critical and pretty secret at the time program. They trained Japanese Americans, the Nisei, to be translators, interpreters, interrogators. They learned Japanese, but also Korean and Chinese. These Nisei soldiers played an absolutely crucial role in the Pacific theater.
That's incredible. But there's a difficult irony there.
It's a profound one. Many of these brave Nisei soldiers serving the U.S. had their own families locked up in American concentration camps back home at the very same time. It's a really stark paradox.
Absolutely staggering. What else during WWII?
It was also a massive induction center. Over 300,000 soldiers were processed through Fort Snelling during World War II, but its active military days were numbered. It was finally decommissioned as a military base in 1946.
So after all that military history, from frontier outpost to WWII hub, how did it become the park we see today?
Well, the idea of preserving it actually started surprisingly early, way back in 1864. But the big steps came later. It was declared a National Historic Landmark in 1960. That was huge.
And the park itself?
Established the very next year, 1961, Fort Snelling State Park was born. But the old fort buildings needed a lot of work.
Right, the actual stone fort.
Exactly. Major reconstruction and restoration kicked off in 1966. And in 1970, it reopened as historic Fort Snelling. The vision then was pretty ambitious. They wanted it to be like Minnesota's Williamsburg.
That sounds like a major effort. Who was behind that?
A lot of dedicated people. The Friends of Fort Snelling group formed in 1961, and they were absolutely crucial. They pushed for the park, they fundraised for the restoration, they've been advocating for it ever since.
They're still involved today?
Very much so. They were instrumental in getting Fort Snelling designated a national treasure in 2016, and they helped fund the Thomas Savage Visitor Center, which is really the gateway to understanding the whole site now.
And it sounds like there's a real effort now to tell all the different stories connected to the fort, not just the military one.
Yes, definitely. There's a growing understanding of the need to acknowledge what some call the colonial cacophony, all the different voices. The Dakota perspective is central, of course, but also the stories of enslaved people who were there, like Dred and Harriet Scott.
They were at Fort Snelling.
They were, yes. Dred Scott sued for his freedom based partly on his time residing in free territory at Fort Snelling. So their story is woven in, along with the soldiers, the immigrants, everyone whose life intersected with this place. It's about embracing that complexity.
It really is a place of converging stories.
Yeah.
But beyond the history, it's also just a beautiful natural area, right?
Oh, absolutely. The park itself has incredibly diverse ecosystems and just stunning views where the rivers meet. And because of that location, at the confluence of two major migration routes, the Mississippi Flyway and the Minnesota River Valley,
Must be amazing for bird watching.
it's a premier birding destination. You've got all sorts of habitats packed in: beach, wetlands, woods, prairie patches, the rivers, the lake. It supports a huge variety of birds, both residents and migrants.
What kind of birds might you see?
Oh, gosh. Bald eagles are pretty common. You hear red-bellied woodpeckers, great horned owls sometimes, lots of black-capped chickadees, mallards, spotted sandpipers near the water. If you're lucky, maybe a pileated woodpecker or hooded mergansers.
Is there a best time to go for birding?
Spring migration is usually peak season. You get the most variety then, but really, any time of year is good. There's even a specific bird checklist for the park you can get.
Any specific hot spots within the park for birds?
Gun Club Lake over on the Dakota County side is often really good. You can see big groups of American coots, diving ducks, great blue herons, great egrets, double-crested cormorants congregating there.
Sounds like a great spot for nature photographers, too. What about other activities? Hiking? Biking?
Tons of options. There's an extensive trail system: hiking, biking, snowshoeing, skiing in winter. And these trails connect up with the wider regional network, so you can go for miles. Trails range from easy paved paths to some more rugged routes.
And water activities.
Definitely. Canoeing, kayaking on the rivers or on Snelling Lake. Fishing is popular too, both in the rivers and the lake. They even have loaner fishing poles available, which is pretty cool.
Tell us more about Snelling Lake.
Sure, it's right there in the park on the St. Paul side. About 101 acres, not super depth, maybe 9.5 feet max. Good fishing for panfish like bluegill and crappie, also bass, northern pike, yellow perch. There's a fishing pier and a nice swimming beach too.
So lots to do. What if you just want a relaxing day?
Plenty of picnic spots scattered around. You can just find a nice spot, enjoy the scenery. And exploring the historic sites can be done at a relaxed pace. The paved paths are generally pretty flat and easy for walking.
Any recommendations for an easier hike with good views?
Pike Ione is fantastic for that. It's right at the confluence, mostly flat, really scenic walk along the rivers. You can do loops from about 1.5 miles up to 4 miles. Great for beginners or just a pleasant stroll.
It's amazing to think about the deep time that shaped this landscape, too. You mentioned glaciers earlier.
Yeah, Minnesota's landscape is basically a product of the last ice age. That last glacial period ended roughly 10,000 years ago, and it completely reshaped everything around here, including the park area.
How did they do that?
Well, as these enormous sheets of ice moved, they scraped and carved the land, and then as they melted, they just dumped huge amounts of rock and sand and gravel. That's called glacial drift or till. It blocked old river valleys, created new ones, and left behind depressions that filled with water to become lakes.
Like Snelling Lake, possibly?
Possibly, or other kettle lakes nearby. Different parts of the ice sheet, called lobes, carry different kinds of rock, creating distinct geological zones. The Minneapolis lobe, the Des Moines lobe, the Superior lobe, they all pass through this area at different times, leaving their mark. For instance, the reddish sandy soil in some areas comes from the Superior lobe grinding down iron-rich rocks from the North Shore.
Fascinating. So the ground beneath your feet tells a story that's thousands of years old. And I understand there are efforts to take care of the park's ecosystems today.
Yes, Fort Snelling is one of the state parks actively involved in ecosystem restoration. The DNR, the Department of Natural Resources, has a program focused on preserving the good natural areas that still exist, but also restoring ecosystems that have been lost or degraded, trying to recreate, where possible, what the landscape looked like before widespread European settlement.
How do they do that?
It involves a lot of things. Careful planning by scientists and park staff, first off, then doing inventories, finding out exactly what plants and animals are there, controlling invasive species, non-native plants that can take over, using prescribed burns.
Fire. That seems counterintuitive.
It's actually a really important natural process for many ecosystems here, like prairies and oak savannas. Fire clears out dead material, helps native seeds germinate, and prevents forests from encroaching where they wouldn't naturally be. It has to be done very carefully, of course.
Okay, that makes sense.
and then planting and seeding with native species to bring back the original plant communities. You can actually see this in action in the landscaping around the visitor center. They've used native grasses and wildflowers.
It shows a real long-term commitment to the health of the park.
Yeah.
Okay, so for listeners who are inspired to check out Fort Snelling State Park, what are the key things to know for a visit?
Well, definitely go. It's such a unique blend of history and nature. Plan to see the historic fort itself, explore the state park trails, and absolutely start at the Thomas Savage Visitor Center. It gives you a great overview with its exhibits.
Anything practical to keep in mind, like hours or fees?
Yeah, the historic fort usually closes for the winter, typically from November through early April. So check the dates if seeing the reconstructed fort is your main goal. But the visitor center is open year-round and has programs. And yes, you'll need a state park vehicle pass, either daily or annual, to get in.
Facilities available?
Yep, restrooms are available, and there's usually plenty of parking.
Great. So wrapping this up, Fort Snelling State Park really is this incredible crossroads. Sacred Dakota land, a key military post witnessing huge moments in history, including tragedies like the US-Dakota War, a training ground, and now this cherished natural space.
Exactly. Being named a national treasure really speaks to its importance, not just for Minnesota, but for the whole country's story.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? How one single spot, this confluence, can hold so many different, sometimes conflicting, layers of history. From the very first people here through all the military eras to today's visitors finding peace or recreation.
It's a powerful reminder. The confluence of the rivers really does mirror the confluence of histories here. We definitely encourage you, if you're interested to explore further, visit the park or maybe dig deeper into one specific part that caught your attention: the Dakota War, the Nisei linguists, the bird life, the glaciers.
Where can people find more info?
The Friends of Fort Snelling website is a great resource. They have lots of information and details on events happening at the park. It's a story that continues to unfold.